Hi, this is Tanya from Tinkering in Ink with Tanya, and I thought it was time for another video. This time we're going to make this fun. It's supposed to be a dreamy Christmas card. I made it as part of the Creative Crew Split Coast Stampers challenges, and this is the card I made, and I thought it would be a good one to demonstrate for you guys. Let's start out with the supplies that you're going to need. You're going to need a piece of watercolor paper cut to 3.5 by 4 3/4. That's the image panel. Then we have a panel to mat that in mint macaron. This is 3 3/4 inch by 5 inches. And then a piece of watercolor paper that is 8.5 by 5.5, or excuse me, 4 1/4 by 8.5, scored in the middle at 5.5 to make a top fold card base. And you want the watercolor paper because it's a nice heavy weight, and we don't have a heavy weight very vanilla, and that was part of the challenge too, is to use very vanilla. And it matches your watercolor panel the best. Then I am also using a scrap of vellum to create the banner for the front. So to get started, we're going to take the watercolor panel and we're going to stamp these two ornaments here really quickly. Well, I shouldn't say really quickly. We're going to stamp them inking up with markers. So we're going to put the first stamp we're going to use is the longer, narrower of the two ornaments from Embellished Ornaments. This set actually has a coordinating die, which I did use to cut out a mask. And you can see I've used this one before. It's just out of some scratch paper. And I had stamped off once on there, and that was a convenient way to get a new mask. Excuse me, my asthma is always giving me trouble, so I apologize if I cough too much. So we're going to start out using 3 pink-red colors. We've got Cherry Cobbler, and Real Red, and Flirty Flamingo. So we're going to get some of the in colors going on this also. So you want to start with your lightest. Take the brush tip part of the marker and start coloring from the top. Don't worry about overlap, especially if you're going light to dark. It won't affect your markers. Real Red's next. Make sure I get the right end here. And yes, there's lots of background noise. You might be hearing some traffic and some birds and a dog panting. I am out on my upstairs deck, which is my happy place. It's full of flowers and prettiness, and I live out in the country. So nobody hears me talking to myself on my deck. We Minnesotans have to enjoy the weather while we can. So I'm going to take a piece of scratch paper and stamp off. I'm going to do a little huffing because it took me a little time to do that. And then I'm going to use a water spritzer. Actually, it's a Stampin' Spritzer that, as you can see, I've marked water. And I'm going to spray this in a direction that's not going to hit some watercolor already. Make sure you have the spritzer pointed in the right way. Okay, I just sprayed my hand. Okay, now we're going to stamp this first ornament. It's pretty wet. I'm actually going to wipe some of the extra water off. Now with watercolor paper, you want to give it a little time to absorb the ink. So I'm just going to let that sit there for a few seconds. And I'll lift that up, and there is our image. And I'm going to clean this stamp up right away. So then we're waiting for that to dry just a little bit. I'm going to switch to the other stamp that we need. That looks pretty dry. Now, I'm really hoping that it's not going to bleed through. I'm going to carefully tape my mask on there. Yes, this is bigger than the actual stamped image. However, we're just going to line up that edge. It doesn't have to be totally perfect, and we actually want it to be just shy of the edge of the ornament so that we can get this entire image on here without a gap between. So now we're going to use some greens. We're going to use Emerald Envy and Mint Macaron and Soft Sky. Believe it or not, this blue does take a green tinge when you pair it with greens. So this time I'm just going to kind of roughly use the pattern on the stamp to decide where I'm going to put the color. So I'm going to start with the Soft Sky. Don't you love how juicy these markers are? And we're going to go with the Mint Macaron. Again, you don't have to be terribly concerned about overlapping a darker color on a lighter color. Remember, this is a Dreamy card. And the Emerald Envy. I really love this new green. Didn't think I would, but I do. Alright, so we're now going to stamp it off once. And spritz it. Find that right spot. That may have been a little more spraying than I really wanted, but we'll see. So now we're going to overlap this up and to the left of the first one. So again, I'm going to put more pressure on the left side because I don't want it to bleed through that mask completely. Let's see if we were successful. Oh yeah, that turned out well. Okay, I could have centered that a little better. We're a little far to the left here. And as you can see, it's still a little wet on the one side. So we're going to let that dry. While we're letting that dry, I'm going to take my scrap of vellum. Where is it hiding? And use my embossing buddy. Boy, I am glad it is not windy right now. Embossing powder in the wind, bad combo. Alright, so now we want the Thinking of You at Christmas. And I have these handy dandy guides that Stampin' Up! Once Upon a Time sold, so you could have lines on your blocks. Love that. And we're going to use some Versamark. Yes, this Versamark pad has been used and used and used. And wow, it's not all awful. What on earth? I think that's a chunk of adhesive. So we're going to ink up this stamp. Make sure I've got the side I want up. And then use the guidelines to help me make sure it's straight on the vellum. Now with vellum, you got to be sure to stamp straight up and straight down, otherwise your image will slide around. Don't know if you can see that. We're going to use some silver embossing powder. Yes, I tap on the lid because I don't want any extra floating around. There you go. Coffee filters are awesome for embossing powder. They don't get static cling, so you can easily pour your powder back in the container. And yes, I like to close my ink pads and put the lid back on my embossing powder before I do anything else, or we would have a mess. Now I'm going to pause this for a minute so that you don't have to listen to the heat tool. Hang on. Alright, that's all embossed. Now I'm going to trim it off. I've just found it's easier to work with a larger piece and then trim down. Ooh. And actually I prefer my guillotine style trimmer for this. But I might have to go use that. Hang on, I'm going to run and use that real quick. Okay, there we go. And I'm just going to trim off the end. We don't sell the rotary trimmer anymore, arm for this thing, for the Stampin' Trimmer. But that's my preferred cutting tool on that. And then I don't recall if we have the 1-inch square punch anymore, but this is an easy way to dovetail your ends. So that piece is completed. And I should have thought of this before, but I haven't cleaned this stamp off. This is our card base, and for the inside of the card, we need to stamp this image and emboss the sentiment, like so. So let's ink this up again. Oops, let's start with the lightest. That was Soft Sky. This is Mint Macaron. And Emerald Envy. There we go. So stamp off once. And spritz. Move some stuff so I don't get it all wet. And I like to make sure that my front, if there's one that's just a little tiny bit longer, one side, I like the front to be the one that's a little bit longer. So that's what we got going on there. Put this in the center. And we don't want a ton of ink to stick with this one, so we're just going to quickly down and up. And we're going to let that dry before we do the embossing. Okay, moving on. Boy, this is going to be a long video. Oops, and then I made everything wiggle. So next we're going to take some smoky slate and the aqua painter. And it doesn't really matter if you use the fine tip or the larger tip. You want some dilute smoky slate here. So all I'm going to do is create a shadowy, dreamy look here again. Dreamy card. So heavier layer closer to the ornaments. So start up close to the ornaments and then work your way out. And you do want a little bit of layering to that dreamy shadow area, and if it gets too dark you can go back and lighten it up some with more water. And the aqua painter keeps the tip of your paintbrush wet. I'm being kind of careful, but not horribly careful. Remember, we're going to put silver caps on the tops of these, so the top of the ornament doesn't have to be perfect. So apparently there's a maximum limit or size on the videos my camera on my phone can take. And luckily it chimes in and lets me know, or I would have been thinking I was recording when nothing was being recorded. Kind of boring watching me paint this, I imagine. Oops, and I picked up some red from the scratch paper. And what's that saying? Dilution is the solution to pollution. So if you pollute your color, just getting more water on it will help dilute that. I think that turned out pretty good. And yes, I do clean my paintbrush on the back of my hand sometimes. So now we need this to dry, and I bet the other piece is dry now too. Let's hit it with the heat tool for just a second here. Since this is watercolor paper, it can take more of that abuse. My poor little embossing buddy is several years old and it's pretty thin. Most of the stuff is gone, the powder. So now we're going to take the other sentiment stamp. And line that up on here. Hopefully straight, although it looks like my little plastic lines are a little crooked. I'm going to ink that up. And now I can't remember if I centered it on the ornament. Nope, it was slightly offset. Okay. Yep, that's in the right direction. Now it's not going to slide around on the watercolor paper. Lift it back up. Get my embossing powder after I put the lid on my Versamark. If I'd been thinking, I could have done both sets of embossing at the same time. Looks pretty good. Just a little bit of stray emboss. Well, my camera turned off again. I must be about at my limit of memory in my phone. Have to delete some stuff apparently. Okay, I'm going to emboss that now. All embossed. We'll set that aside. And I think this is pretty dry too. I better heat set that just to be sure. Otherwise the embossing powder will stick all over the place. Okay, so now I'm ready to emboss the caps and the hangers. So I put one on each end of this. Oh yeah. When I did this last time, I used my lines, centered it on there so that I could use the lines as a guide for the center and one across the bottom, so I knew exactly where I was stamping. Alright, my big head might get in the way here. Now for the one hanger, I don't think we're going to get 2 hangers. I don't remember if I used the embossing buddy. Well, if I didn't, then we're mighty lucky because there isn't a bunch of stray stuff on there. I suppose I better put the other hanger on there too. Make sure I'm not touching any of the other embossing powder. Okay. Time to go heat and bop. Okay, that's done. So the next step is to stitch this panel, which I'm not going to do. I'll do that off camera, but what I do is adhere this panel to the mint macaron. Ooh, looks like these aren't actually what I intend. Oh, I must not have trimmed this one down yet. Basically, you want a 1/4 inch difference between these two because you want that narrow narrow matting. So I'll adhere this to this and then stitch all the way around this, and then I'm going to put dimensionals on the back and adhere it to the card base, and then the card is complete. Thanks for watching. I hope you stop by and visit my blog, and hopefully I'll have another video for you soon. Bye-bye.